Firstly, thanks to Saeed and to the rest of the team for giving me and all of the other speakers these wonderful opportunities to connect what we do with all of you. And so the purpose of today's talk is, so you will have all seen it as the science of innovation. Unfortunately, that's really kind of the series in which this talk is. Instead, I want to bring this new idea about how, as a scientist, how we approach these ideas of success and failure, and particularly in a world we cannot predict. So nowadays, as we move forward, lots of changes are happening. There's a lot of complexity, both in the scientific world as well as the business world. And what I aim to do today is to convince all of you that we have to think about success and failure in a totally different way when we're looking at this new world of the future. So a little bit about me. My name's Peter, and some of you have heard this joke, but for those of you who haven't, as you can tell by this ridiculous accent, I'm Australian. So not everybody can be perfect, but that's how it goes. And really my mission is to turn the art of disruptive innovation into a science. And this is, I'm 37 years old now, I finally came to understand what my life's mission is. And so I think it's a reasonable one. So my backstory is actually studied quantum physics. So I have a background in that, and I studied in Germany. And some of you who say that I'm South African or have that inclination, probably that's where that comes from. But really it's, for me, what I've done is made this transition from being a scientist to then a corporate advisor. And so what I do nowadays, I spend most of my time advising governments and the private sector in how to approach these ideas of disruptive innovation. I'm going to share some of those core ideas with you guys today. I do a bit of teaching, so I teach at London Business School, also NYU Abu Dhabi, and I've taught at the high colleges of technology. And if I had a superpower that I aspire to, it would be to take complexity and turn it into simplicity. So a bit of the mischief that we get up to. I'm the managing partner of a company called Ektibaar. Ektibaar, obviously the transliteration for, in Arabic for innovation. So we do some work with the Ministry of Education, actually, on one of the initiatives to help Emiratis to transition from the educational sector then into lives in advanced sciences. Another one is working with 10X up at the top. We also teach entrepreneurship and innovation. And one of my favorite and most recent projects, does anyone know who this guy is? No? He's the chairman of a plucky startup called Hyperloop Transportation Technologies. And they'll be creating the first Hyperloop in the world, the commercial Hyperloop in Abu Dhabi. So I do a lot of speaking in Abu Dhabi and say nice things about Dubai. Unfortunately, here in Dubai, I have to say some nice things about Abu Dhabi as well. Now, what you're going to see throughout today is a take-home point. One of my lecturers at university used to talk about these things. He said, everything that I talk about is interesting, but the stuff that's going to be on the exam is the take-home point. So there's no exam here, but rest assured that I'll bring these things up, and these are sort of the core ideas that will coalesce. So the first thing I want to talk with all of you about is this idea of asking why. And I'll take you back 3,000 years. And this is the story. Does anyone know what story this is? It's the story exactly of David and Goliath. For 3,000 years, we've had, since this fable, for 3,000 years we've had this idea that David was under some systemic disadvantage by virtue of being smaller than Goliath. And recently, Malcolm Gladwell has talked about it, and other historians have talked about it as well, that in fact, there's something that we can think about from the perspective of David being smaller and more nimble, and actually having an advantage in being small and being nimble, in being able to defeat Goliath. And the reason why I use this is as analogy to think about today we have startups that are totally revolutionizing business models and totally putting large companies or large organizations out of business. And they do this by virtue of the fact that they understand the problem that is being solved, sometimes more deeply than some of these larger companies. So the way that they do it is to bring these ideas of asking why like a child might. You know, every time you'll see, either as a parent, who's a parent? So some of you are parents, about 20% of the crowd. You'll notice that your child will come up to you, particularly from the ages of about 2 to 4. They'll come and tug at you and say, why is this? And it's this incredible curiosity that kids have that we unfortunately as adults lose as we get older. But it's this insatiable curiosity to ask why things are the way that they are. And as a scientist, what I get to do is answer problems like why as a living. So it's great that in science we get to keep that part of ourselves and we don't have to lose it. But if we look at some of the situations, and I'll bring you from 3,000 years ago to about 100 years ago, when this gentleman called Lord Kelvin, so his name is the temperature scale. So back in those days, back in these days, sort of in the late 1800s, you were pretty cool when you got a unit of measurement named after you. And the cooler you are, the better the unit of measurement. So temperature scales are quite important. So to have the Kelvin temperature scale named after you is a pretty cool thing. There's something that Lord Kelvin said. He said back in 1895, he said that heavier than air flying machines were impossible. So at the time they had blimps, they had balloons. You know, they understood this concept of lighter than air flight, so with hot air balloons and things like this. But nobody had achieved heavier than air flight. So this idea of a space frame that produces lift through wings. And then of course there were these two plucky gentlemen. Who are these guys? Wilbur and Orville Wright. And of course in 1903 they asked the question, well, why isn't heavier than air flight possible? And indeed, when we look at the way that they thought about approaching this problem, what we'll understand is they created one of the biggest disruptions in history, particularly when it came to heavier than air flight. And they did so by thinking about solving a deeper problem. And the deeper problem was understanding the physics and the engineering of heavier than air flight. What's really interesting, and this is one of the tales that are told, is that they always left the house with spare parts to be able to repair because they always kept crashing. And so the thing is that the disruption that they created was actually one where they were incremental in their approach and they used iterative methods. So they actually approached the problem as scientifically as we may do any experiment today. They thought about steps incrementally, and they used the process of iteration to figure out how things worked. And finally in 1903, as all of us know, they produced this flight. Now, if we take something from 3,000 years ago, we've come to 100 years ago, and now to today, Uber also thinks about solving a particular problem. So the question they ask is, why do you need taxis to transport people from A to B? Now, what's the new question? Even above this question, what's the new question that Uber is asking?
What we will use.
What we will use. Okay. So instead of using taxis to transport people from A to B, the new question they're actually asking is, why do you need people to transport people from A to B? So this concept now is this idea of gradually refining and iterating even further than they have done on this process, and trying to understand why a person is necessary in the future of transportation of people. And of course we come back to this famous quote from Henry Ford: if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So it's very important to realize that sometimes the problem you think is the problem is not actually the problem that you're looking to solve. And if we had thought incrementally about solving this problem of transportation, everybody would have thought about making a horse 5% faster. But nobody in that paradigm of thinking would have thought about solving the problem in a totally different and new way. So I get asked all the time, Peter, can you explain to me what innovation is? And unlike traditional consultancies that are charged by the hour and by the number of people that they send to you on their consultancy, I also think about the idea of innovation, I would say, quite differently. And rather than introducing this layer of complexity to make the problem, to make the solution even more complex than the problem it's trying to solve, I think that the idea of innovation can actually be expressed much more elegantly. And this is the explanation. If you take a problem, and the extent of that problem is sort of characterized by this circle, and then you find that there's a solution that overlaps, in the position of overlap between those two, that's where you can create value. And innovation is realizing what's the problem, what is the solution that then maps to that problem, and how can I create value out of the overlap. And if you want to create an even more innovative or interesting solution, then all you want to do is actually bring these circles together so that the overlap is greater. And in doing so, you create further and further levels of innovation. So then what that means really is that the problem is much more important, much greater, and arguably what we should be focusing on rather than the solution. And I've noticed a lot of the time, and particularly with some of the work that I do, that everybody's so focused on the solution. Everybody's constantly focused on, you know, I'll say the usual innovation bingo of blockchain and artificial intelligence and all the rest of these bingo buzzwords that we can play in innovation. But really the important thing is understanding that that solution is only valuable when it solves a problem. And the way that we think about these things typically is we start with a solution and try to work our way backwards. But in fact, I hope I've been able to convince you from some of the examples that I've used that we should be thinking about things in a totally counterintuitive way, but certainly the way that we think about it in science. We think firstly about the problem, and then we map the solution. So first take-home point, deeply understanding the problem comes before creating the solution. And there's something that Einstein said, I don't have a slide for it, but he was asked once, if you had an hour to solve a complex problem, how would you go about it? And he said, I would spend the first 55 minutes addressing the problem, and then the last 5 minutes thinking about a solution. So that's one important one. So let's take it to something that we're all a little bit more familiar with. A gentleman here, who knows what event this is? I'll give you guys a little bit of time to think about it.
This is SpaceX's physics.
Which one?
The first one that we are using.
If you can't recognize it, if you're a bit of a SpaceX fan person, I don't want to say fanboy or fangirl, there's something interesting about this particular one in the top left. This is the first time that they landed 2 simultaneous rockets. And so, of course, the prevailing thinking at the time, certainly in the time of NASA, was that the question was never asked back in the days, why can't we re-land rockets? And one of the interesting ideas that SpaceX asked was, why can't we reuse space rockets? And the way that he thought about it was really in this scientific method to think from first principles. So does anyone here, do we have scientists in the room? We have a data scientist. I don't know if you technically qualify, but you studied mathematics, you're okay. It's okay. Dr. Eva, of course, from our chief data scientist from IBM is with us this evening. And because we know each other, I can make jokes on a public forum like that, and she'll forgive me afterwards. But anyone else, science background? So who wants to explain first principles, this idea, the scientific idea of first principles? So it's about taking a problem. Usually we identify things in the symptoms, but when we boil them down to their essence, we identify what are called the root causes. Some of you in quality management might have heard about the 5 whys and about Kaizen and all these sorts of things. That's where a lot of that comes from, the fishbone diagram. It's about trying to understand and asking why repeatedly. So why are things like this? Why are things like this? And then boiling things down to their essence. If you boil it down for SpaceX, what Elon Musk asked of this thing was, where is the cost in all of these space launches? And what he discovered was that 97% of the cost of a space launch is actually the rocket, and only 3% is in the fuel. So that understanding led him to a solution which said, well, why should we throw a rocket, a perfectly good rocket, every time we launch into space? And so his idea was then landing this rocket. It's actually an old idea. It actually came, it turns out, from his university professor who first thought about this. But of course, he's now in a position where he can deliver. And so this idea of reusing rockets comes from understanding how the cost structure is actually applied. And that's where he brought it in. Now, there's another less well-known thing, and we'll enjoy this all together. He didn't get this right the first time. And so what this is a mashup of all of the different failures. So we'll enjoy some of these for about a minute, I think, until we go to the next part. But what you'll realize is that he actually got it wrong most of the time, and it's only very recently that he's had some success in some of them. I like this one. That's one of my favorites. So we can enjoy lots and lots and lots of these, but we probably don't have the time for the talk. But some of these are really brilliant. And then of course, you'll see on Elon Musk's face this sort of delight in seeing how some of these things go wrong. And there's a deeper point that I want to make here, which is sort of the focus of this talk. That was a great one as well. Anyway, let's move on. Again, we come to a take-home point, and now I'm driving into what is really the crux of this presentation, which is that informative failures, those failures that Elon Musk had and SpaceX had, those informative failures can be more useful than lucky successes. So it's important here that we understand that as we're doing these experiments, whether in the scientific realm, whether in the engineering, or indeed even in the business realm, that failure is actually far more informative to us than the time where we might just luckily get some success. And so I want to ask you guys a different question. What if you couldn't fail? So this understanding that when we're doing these things, we have to understand what failure and success actually means. So what if, I'm going to ponder this question, we'll unpack it over the next couple of minutes. What if you couldn't fail? And this is now reframing this idea of risk, this idea of failure and success as a probability, through something I like to call smart failure. So when you look at this, I'm going to bring you back to a little point. What is this word? Risk. Who wants to have a stab at its meaning? I always enjoy doing this, especially when there are Emiratis in the room, and Arabs in general. So what does this word actually mean? Who wants to have a guess? What does it mean? Risk? Okay, so it turns out that the meaning of the word, and I'm still on a search, I'm constantly refining and iterating my idea. It turns out it's the deterministic allocation of resources. So what it means is that your wealth, how we identify it, is that your wealth is predetermined from before you were born, and that's what you get in your life. It's predetermined. The most important point about that idea is that it's economic in nature. Of course, in English, what we've done, the word risk in English, of course, the etymology stems from the Arabic word here. Think about risk in an entirely different way in English. We attribute it probabilistically, meaning what is the chance of something working or not working? What is the chance of success or failure? And this is really what the paradigm that defines how we think about things, particularly in the business world. In science, we think about things totally differently, and I'll show you why. So when we think about risk, risk doesn't measure the probability or chance of success or failure. What it instead measures is the economic impact of some of the decisions that we take that lead to success or failure. So let me unpack this in a way that you can understand. I actually really like diagrams, and I like explaining things in this way. So if we take a linear decision, and if we understand the risk in that decision, what we understand is that if we take a decision that has some sort of a ratio like this, what we then understand is if we take this decision and it goes bad, then a downside has, a certain value. But if we look at success, the success has a certain upside. Now, is this the kind of decision that we would want to take from a risk perspective? If we get it wrong, we lose. And if we get it right, we win. But we win the same amount as we lose, right? So this is kind of what I consider a linear decision. So linear decisions are great, but let's look at exponential decisions. So exponential decisions are quite different, but they have an unfair proportion of upside and downside. So when we take an exponential decision, what we're looking at is when we take that decision, the downsides on those types of decisions. So if we take that decision or whatever it happens to be and fail, what we notice is that's the downside there. And what do you think is going to happen when I show the upside? Right? So on this kind of decision, the success is much higher. So when we look at Elon Musk's, through Elon Musk's lens or that perspective, what is the success factor of figuring out how to get a rocket to land? It's 97 times what it would be otherwise, because every time he launches a rocket, he gets to save 97% of the costs. So imagine that's a problem worth solving. And the economic upside of that, or the economic impact, is actually very high. So it's worth going through all of those failures, even repeatedly, and even at all of the costs, because we're going to recoup those costs as we move forward. And so that's an example there. So let me give you a methodology for how to think about these things in order to stack all of the decisions that you take to make them exponential. Firstly, there's an element of time. So if you're going to fail, you want to make that failure as fast as possible. So making it quick means that you're able to make more of these decisions and create more of these opportunities to fail, indeed, so that you can explore this space of possibility. The second one is that you want to make it as cheap as possible. Now, in the case of rockets, the last example that we've had, obviously those are expensive. But they're expensive only in consideration to us as sort of normal human beings. But if you think about the problem that he's trying to solve, success solving that kind of a problem has these extraordinary benefits. And the third, and arguably the most important, is that when we fail informatively. That is, that the time, the energy, the resources that we spend will actually stack in such a way that when we have these failures, we're actually going to learn something from them. And this is super important. So then what we do is actually change the entire definition of success and failure to mean something entirely differently. So when we look at it, we say we want to minimize our exposure. In this case, exposure is economic in nature. We want to minimize our exposure to failure in order to maximize our chance of success. So as Elon Musk has done, as Edison indeed said, I found 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb. Elon Musk has found every single way not to make a rocket land. You'd agree. So here what we're trying to do is figure out in this space of possibilities, when we're solving problems we've never solved before, when we're creating solutions we've never created before, that we have to understand that failure is going to be our default state. So the thing is not to avoid it, the thing is to understand it so that we can actually figure out a way to move forward. Let me give you then a sort of a rock solid example that all of you can take home. So imagine all of us are playing Battleships. So I'm playing a game of Battleships against each one of you. Everybody knows how Battleship works? Show of hands. You're not familiar with it? Okay. The TLDR lesson on Battleships. It goes like this. Battleships is a 10 by 10 grid. So you have 10 across the top and 10 down the sides. 10 numbers and 10 letters, the first 10 letters of the alphabet. So what you do on your space is set up a number of ships, some with length 3, some with length 4, some with length 5, and there's a pesky little one that has a length 2, which is always the most difficult to find. And what you'll do is set them up within this grid, and your partner on the other side, obviously you can't see, will set theirs up as well. And so the purpose of the game is to call out a coordinate, and then you try to sink their ship. Now the thing is this, under normal circumstances, if we both, myself and each one of you, if we played by our set of rules, what would happen is I would give a coordinate and you would tell me if I was right or if I was wrong, and you do the same. But let's change the rules. Let's change the rules using this smart failure approach. Let's imagine that every time I took a shot, you'd be able to take twice as many shots as I did because they took half the length of time, right? So let's say every time I take a shot, I can take a shot every 10 seconds, but you can take a shot every 5 seconds. You still won't guarantee that you'll hit all the ships, but you'll get to explore this space how much more quickly than I will. Right? With half the speed, twice as fast. Half the length of time, I should say. Let's assume now that in this space of possibility of 100 squares, I can only afford to take 50 shots. But your shots are half the price, so you can explore this entire space of possibility. So you can take 100 shots. What does that mean about when we're playing together? What does logic tell you? If we're playing a game together and you can hit all 100, once again? So there's some element of certainty. So what you're introducing is not that none of this is knowing where the ships are, right? But the purpose here is to understand that what we want to do is explore this space as efficiently as we possibly can, because it's still random. And thirdly, what if every time I take a shot, I only get to see the square that I actually pick? But what if you take a shot and you choose this square and you actually get to see all of these squares for free? What would that say about the length of time it will take you to explore this space? So every time you take one shot, you get 9 shots. So your rules when we're playing together, you get 2 shots for every 1 shot that I take. You get twice as many shots for every shot that I get to take. And thirdly, every time you hit a square, you get to see all 8 squares around it, so 9 squares in total for every 1 shot that I take. What does that say when we play together? What does that say about the amount of times I might win in comparison to you if we played 100 games? How many games do you think I would win? I might win 1 in 100. And I would win it because of? Luck. So the point here is that there is a way, through this analogy, there is a way with all of the decisions that you guys are taking in your various disciplines and in your various work, that you can actually think about hacking the decision-making process, not to be right or wrong. That's not at all what we're interested in. We're not interested in success or failure. In fact, we totally abstract success and failure from our decision-making process. Instead, what we do is we say, let's think about creating a structure so we can take as many decisions as possible. Those decisions can cost us as little as possible, and we can learn as much as we can from them. And this is the model that we want to use moving forward. This is an interesting one. Who knows what this event is referring to? I'll read it out to you and then you can figure it out. You'll have to translate pounds into American dollars to get a feeling for it. But there was a tweet that came out that said, humans are mental. 198 million pounds for a football player. Imagine putting 198 of the world's greatest scientists into a room together for 1 year and paying them £1 million each. What are the things that they discover and create? So what is this person's approach to trying to solve scientific problems? Incidentally, the football player that was traded here was, Neymar Jr. when he was transferred to PSG, Paris Saint-Germain. So this person looked at the approach and said, for that equivalent amount of money, I don't know which scientist would come up with something interesting, but we gave a ton of scientists a ton of money and distributed it equally amongst them, someone would come up with something interesting. Let's take this idea a little bit further. The graph that you see on the left is the graph of the profit and loss calculations for global banks in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis. So what you'll notice is that they made a little bit of money fairly consistently, as banks are engineered to do, right? They give money at profit, and then the profit comes back to them. So for every dollar they give you, they'll get $1.05 back. It's kind of like an unbreakable business. It's a business that can only make money. But indeed, because of leverage and because of the extra risk that they took, we found out that in 2008, a coalescence of circumstances arose, and the banks in that line, by the way, lost more money than all the profits they'd made in the entire history of human banking. Just let that sink in for a moment. So this is what we refer to. I'm a big fan of Nassim Taleb. Those of you who know me know that I mention him ad nauseum sometimes. Nassim Taleb actually came up with this idea of black swans. So black swans are things that happen that have a high impact and a very low probability. So they're things that are highly uncertain but also highly impactful. And so the interesting thing here is that some people predicted, if you watch the movie The Big Short, some people predicted that this would happen and actually bet against the market and made a ton of money. But for all intents and purposes, all the banks lost that money, and then we know the consequences of that. If I show you this, this is the timeline of Elon Musk's investing activities. And what do you notice that's the total opposite of what we showed in the banking sector? So he makes lots and lots of investments into lots and lots of companies. But what do you notice about his return profile? In most cases, he loses. So he takes lots and lots and lots of bets. Obviously, they're not very, well, they're large for us. These bets that he takes are probably more than each one of us will earn in a lifetime. But he takes those bets, some smaller, some larger. But you'll notice that his distribution is mostly unsuccessful. But what you'll also notice is that when he has successes, they're usually pretty big. Does anyone know what the $180 million exit was? PayPal. And how did he distribute the money once he got the money? SpaceX? Tesla? And Solar City. He took all $180 million and divided it in various portions back into his businesses. And some of those are down there as well. So what we understand is that we can have these highly improbable, highly impactful events that are negative in nature. These are called negative black swans. But then we can also have some that are positive in nature. And so this is this idea of understanding risk from a different perspective. This idea of spreading bets, but then hoping that the ones that work might be seldom, but they'll be incredibly high in value. And these are, of course, the exponential decisions. So if we manage now risk, if we want to manage risk using this new paradigm of thinking, not thinking about the success or failure of individual projects, but instead managing them as a portfolio, what we'll think about now is, as the gentleman said with the 198 scientists, imagine that this is our collective value in our portfolio, and each one of these bets that we're going to take, we give the same startup capital, let's say. And what we do over time is we'll give them the same amount, a small amount of resources to kick them off. And then we'll notice that naturally some of them are going to do better and some of them are going to do worse. And in fact, it might be that 90% of our portfolio does really badly from a decision-making perspective. So all of you, I know some of you personally, some of you are working in the government and have this innate fear that the particular decision that you might take might be wrong. And of course that has consequences on your job prospects, consequences on accelerating through various promotions and things like that. And the unfortunate circumstance is that every person is tied individually to individual projects. But if we instead thought about all of the work that everybody's doing as a portfolio, and we look at the collective return of this portfolio instead of the sum of individual projects, what we then come to understand is that we think in a totally different way. Firstly, the success or failure of any one project, remember, lucky informative failures are actually better for us than lucky successes. So if we're lucky but we didn't know how we got lucky, that's not useful to us. We may have gotten lucky and that's great, but that's not actually useful. So some of these ideas that don't work might be the very ideas that either pivot into a new idea or may actually inform some of the other ideas to grow better. And this is part of what we're doing when we're working in this field of innovation. We're trying to solve problems we've never solved before. And so in that basis, we don't know, we say in Latin a priori, we don't know prior to doing that thing which one of these is going to be successful. It was really funny actually. One of the personal stories is I did some work for a company, and we came up with 38 ideas. 38 projects, in fact. We had hundreds of ideas, and those ideas came together thematically and then eventually turned into 38 projects. And we took it to the CFO and we showed him our innovation portfolio. We said, these are the 38 ideas that we're going to be moving forward. And he said, well, instead of 38 ideas, can't you just take the best 3 and just do those alone? So under everything that we've talked about, you can understand what my response to that was, right? So this is the unfortunate downsides of having who has a finance MBA? Saying finance MBA? Eva? You don't have a finance MBA? Ah, CFA. Well, I'm sorry to all of you people. Think scientifically. So then we move from this point, and finally when we look at this portfolio development, now we understand which of the ideas are taking more effect. And so finally we can actually move into those ideas and actually see which are the ones that we want to focus our efforts on. And we understand that this innovation portfolio is a continuous cycle. So as ideas are coming in from our organizations, we take those ideas, but we manage them on this portfolio level rather than as individual projects managed separately. We actually manage them together. So then how that looks is that you'll actually put them into this portfolio. And so this is a portfolio of time where you think about the ideation process at the beginning. You come up with ideas and you sort of have lots and lots of ideas. And then the size of the ideas you can think about as as they grow, sort of the level of risk decreases. And so then you know what the return profile is going to look like on some of those ideas. And indeed, for corporates, usually we're looking at a financial return. So this might be the financial impact of one of these ideas. But if you think about it from a government innovation portfolio perspective, what these could look like, for example, a social impact. So if these are various social impact projects, we can measure the KPIs of these projects just as rigorously as we might any business impact, financial impact usually, but we can measure them with that same level of clarity. And then finally, when we come forward, what we understand is not all the ideas have to work, but if we get 3 very impactful projects out of, this happens to be 26 projects, there's a reason for that, but we'll talk about that later. As we move forward, even if only some of them work, or they might work at different levels, the important thing here is to understand that we still, in total, have created this huge impact. And so that's what's important. So what does that framework actually look like? Well, first we go through the ideation stage. So we have lots of ideas that you're seeing visually represented at the top. And then we want to identify the challenges and the problems that exist in the organization. Then we move forward into the integrate phase. So here we develop minimal viable products. And rather than thinking theoretically about what might happen, we go into experimental phase and we test those ideas as quickly as we possibly can. It's not whether we think something's going to work, it's whether our market or our stakeholders actually respond to it. And the problem seems to be that people wait far too long to test the ideas. And the reason for that sometimes is people have a lot of sunk costs. They're firmly attached. If you're like me and like the people that I work with, we come up with lots and lots of ideas. We're not emotionally attached to them. So we'll come up with some great ideas, we'll come up with some not so great ideas. But the point here is that ideas are really kind of superfluous. And the thing is that it's only ideas that are executed, and executed compellingly, that have any value, whether financial or social or whichever way you measure your KPIs. And so the second part's the integrate phase. We want to test these ideas as quickly as possible. So we move them into the minimal viable product phase. And what we're doing is actually testing whether the problem we think is the problem, and whether the solution we think is going to be a solution that maps to that problem is there. So we're not building the product. We're actually testing the problem, and we're testing the solution. And we want to do that as quickly as possible. Then we move from there into the implement phase. So this is where we begin when we notice the few ideas that are actually working really well. And by the way, the pipeline, like any pipeline, is consistently flowing. So there are ideas that are coming in at the top, from the left, and they're flowing through to the right. From my perspective, you guys get it. So finally, out of that coalesce some interesting ideas. And then again, those ideas, we still give them the opportunity to grow. We still continue to do so. It's very important that those ideas also get some love, because it might be that the learnings from those failures actually help us in our future wild successes. So let's look at a quick case study. One of the clients I worked with had a particular problem, and I'll just run you through how we think about these problems really using first principles to drive down into the root causes and to think about that. And I didn't know any of this, but it turns out that when a shop moves out of a mall and a new shop moves in, apparently that process takes a really long time. And anyone work in real estate and understands that problem? So it turns out, you got the nerdy kid with the glass, that's me at 5. Just kidding. That's not me at 5. I was very different at 5, but anyway. So it turns out, if you put your thinking hat on and actually look at it from a non-business perspective, look at it instead as a process, look at it in this way, you think there's a problem here. So what's the problem? Well, it takes a certain number of months. I've had to redact this, unfortunately. These are the actual slides that we gave to the CEO. So it takes a certain amount of months to switch a store. Wow, I even put the mall there. Sorry. Sorry to the owner of that company. No one's from Eldar here, are they? Anyway. So besides the value, it had a value. So there's a value of that portfolio of all of the different shops that move out. And so what we figured out, why does it take that length of time? And what we figured out then was that there's a lack of coordination between the exiting store and the entering store. And in fact, they actually use 2 teams to do what should be done by 1. And so finally we looked at the solution. We said, who else faces the same problem? So when you abstract the problem down to its root cause, what you actually understand is that it's a team that has to do something very quickly in a short space of time. It has to do that thing, the exit and the entry of the new store has to happen in a quick space of time. So we said, let's totally think wildly about where we might be able to find a team that does exactly this. And so our inspiration came from Formula 1. Why is it when you try to do things for people that they never work? There we go. So let's look at this situation and let's break it down. What's happening before the car comes in? The team is prepared and in a state of readiness. You notice they're not moving, but because everything's being prepared beforehand. And so finally, as they wait, they prepare. The car comes in. The car comes in, and look at the activity. The same person who takes the wheel off is the same person who puts the wheel on. And then finally, they're very relaxed because the work has been done. The preparation has been done before. And then at that later stage, they seem pretty relaxed. So what we did was actually took learnings from this very thing and said, how can we apply this? Because they are at the extreme end of doing this changeover. We said, what can we learn from it? So we understood that we have to streamline the processes. So we went to the municipality and asked them the question, stupid question, can we actually get paperwork done before the thing happens? You know, the confirmation paperwork? Well, you know now how it was. And they said, well, for you guys, yes. So we said, okay. And they said, well, nobody ever asked us whether we could do that, but of course we can do that. Nothing stops us. So we said, we'll just send out people to check it later, but you can pre-confirm the work. The second one was then this pre-approved paperwork. And then most importantly was a single team that manages both the exit and the entry of the second store. And it turns out that there was a 26x improvement. That's 2.6 times bigger than 10x. Just putting it out there. But the point here is that thinking about this thing in a totally unconventional way, if it was a business person or a financially motivated person would have only looked for the incremental innovation. They would have said, how can we make this quicker? How can we make that quicker? We said, we have to scrap the entire process as it is and rebuild a new process. And so indeed, they've since built a new process and they've improved the factor by 26x. So let's bring this thing home. How does all of this tie back to science? The idea of portfolio management, the idea of treating things as experiments. How do we bring all of that back? This is a gentleman that I personally have beef with, and I'll tell you guys why. This gentleman was one half of Novozolov and Geim, and in 2006 they made the discovery of a single layer of hexagonally bound carbon atoms, and that is called graphene. And the thing is that 6 months later, my PhD was in Germany, and I was working, one of my side projects was actually on this. It was on graphene. So mine was on single layer nanowires and things like, I won't bore you with any of them, but connected to that was this idea of graphene. And their graphene was crap. They used to make it using what's called the pencil method. So when you write in a pencil, as you drag the pencil across, what you're actually leaving are single layers of graphene, and indeed multiple layers, and that's what you see as lead. And these guys had the bright idea of cutting a pencil open and actually taking sticky tape, they call it the Scotch tape method, for those of you familiar with this, and actually figured out how to make graphene in this really crappy way. We used to make it in a different German proper way, and it was much nicer. And our graphene wafers were actually 2 inches in diameter. These were about 10 micron, 10 millionths of a meter. The point, however, nevertheless, is they did it fast and cheap. They learnt a lot, and so they beat us to it. And in 2010, they won the Nobel Prize in physics for the discovery of graphene and for something called the fractional quantum Hall effect, which again, I won't bore you with. But we were this close. And in fact, the paper that we published in 2007, which we wrote in 2006, was one of the supporting papers that actually got them the PhD, got them the Nobel Prize. And I want to remind you guys of something. When Einstein wrote his 4 revolutionary papers, I mean, they changed the course of physics. He wrote them in 1905. It was only in 1921 that the award was given. So there was a huge 16 years, right? 16? Yep. 16 years in a time difference. These guys got it in 5 years. They got from 2005 to 2010. There's something interesting, as a story I'll tell you. They had this interesting thing. They called it Friday night experiments. And what they did was they would run experiments on the side, sort of next to all of the PhD and postdoc projects as well. And they had 24 experiments over the course of 3 years. And they had a rule about how they did it. So they had a number of people. They said, you can choose anything you want to do as this Friday night experiment. And indeed, the 2 gentlemen, Novozolov and Geim, worked together at a university whose name escapes me at the moment. I think it's Nottingham, but I'm not sure. And what they did was encourage everybody to do their own experiments separate to their PhD and postdoc projects. And they had 24 of them. There were 3 notable outcomes. So 3 out of 24s, 12.5%. So there were 12.5% of interesting outcomes. One was that they studied geckos' feet. They wanted to understand how it is that a gecko, which weighs quite a bit, is able to stick to a wall. And when they looked at a microscope, what they actually commercialized was a mechanism to create a product that can actually stick things to walls. So that was one commercialized product. The second one was, in physics, there's something called a Nobel Prize, but there's also something equally interesting called an Ig Nobel Prize. And these 2 gentlemen are the only ones that have won a Nobel Prize and the Ig Nobel Prize. So what's an Ig Nobel Prize? It's a scientifically interesting discovery that has no use for humanity, right? So these are the only 2 that have won both. And their Ig Nobel Prize was in understanding that water has interesting magnetic properties. So what this guy actually did, this is the interior of a superconducting magnet. And what he did the first time to test this idea of water's magnetic properties was actually took a cup of water and threw it into a $1.5 million superconducting magnet. And what he discovered was that water actually levitates. So it levitates because it has this diamagnetic property, which is really interesting. So he said, well, I know something else that has water inside it. And so he decided to put a frog inside this thing. And that's a frog which has a high water content, magnetically levitating, which is super interesting. And for this, they won the Ig Nobel Prize. So that's the second project. The first project of the 24 also turned out to be a Friday night experiment, and that was the discovery of graphene. So out of 24 projects, only 3 were of any interest. 1 was a commercialized product. The other one was an Ig Nobel Prize. And the other one out of 24, won them the Nobel Prize. So this is this way that they consider thinking about a portfolio strategy for innovation as well. So when we compare the corporate boardroom, I'm not going to bore you with all of them, but just with some of them. In a corporate boardroom and in corporate thinking, we think we were successful once, we'll do the same thing again. So what we do is use our past results to determine our future outcomes. But in the science lab, we say that the problems that we're trying to solve are so extreme and so advanced that we can't possibly know how to solve them. And this is this idea of thinking as a child and giving respect to the problem that we can't possibly know how to solve it. So we have to take an entirely different non-business approach to solving that. Some of my favorite ones are knowledge comes from the market in business. Here, we're similar in saying knowledge comes from the experiment. Failure in business is a loss of profit. And failure, of course, in science is a tool for validated learning. And one of my favorite ones is to think about in business, we throw more people that we can at the problem. And so we sort of treat it like an army in business. We say, well, you know, twice as many people solve the problem in half a time. What we realize in science, number one, is that we're constrained by the resources that we have. And secondly, we think about solving problems in new ways. It's not often times that the problem is going to solve with more people. It's going to be solved in thinking differently about the problem. And so in science, the team, by the way, in our team that made the discovery was 6 people. That's all we have. Professor, a couple of postdocs, I was a PhD student, and we had a couple of, we called them grunts, doing the scientific work. I used to be that guy once too. And that's how we think about things. And now I want to really sort of end by giving you guys a different idea about solving problems in totally unconventional ways. I'm going to narrate this for you. So this is a gentleman who's doing things right. Right? It's in a cycling team, but he decides he's had enough of it, and he's going to try something completely different. And so you'll notice that this road, if we do the first principles on it, this road's a little bit different. And what he's done is he's using effort to do this, but he's using effort in an entirely different way. And so he's actually managed to take his competitors on in a very unconventional approach. And the funny thing is that nobody's copying him, you'll notice. They're saying that can't possibly work, he's just being lucky. And so as he moves on, you realize he gets to, who's this guy? He's sort of heading towards, he's in the market lead, right? And he gets up to him. The punchline comes at the end. Bear with me, it's 90 seconds. So he sees him and you can tell he's just frustrated. He's saying, how can this happen? And then he, of course, gets right all the way to the market leader with a competitive advantage. And he sees him and he says, hang on a second, I'm going to get on some of that as well. And finally he realizes, even the market leader has said, we've got to try something a little bit different. But what happens when you have some sustained competitive advantage, what's unfortunate, is that you'll go back to your old way of doing things. And if this is not the best understanding of 90 seconds of disruptive innovation, I don't know what is. But that's an interesting one. And so really, in this, the final take-home point before we end is that you can't predict the outcome of any idea looking forwards. You can only do that looking backwards. And on that, I'd like to thank you guys so much.